I never thought I would end up here, sitting in a cold, empty room, staring at the same four walls that have witnessed the best and worst of my life. But here I am, reflecting on everything that led up to this moment, the moment when I realized my life wasn't what I thought it would be. My name is Liza, and I've been married to Richard for over 15 years. When we first got together, it felt like everything was perfect. We were in our late 20s, ambitious, passionate, full of energy, and convinced that our love would conquer anything. But the years have a way of wearing you down. I didn't see it coming. One day, I woke up and realized that I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror anymore. I didn't recognize my life. Richard and I had grown apart. At first, it was small things. Him coming home late from work, being too tired to talk, his eyes constantly glued to his phone. And then, before I knew it, we were living like strangers under the same roof. I felt like a ghost in my own house. We'd spend days without having a real conversation, just passing each other in the hallway like ships in the night. His job consumed him, and I was left here, alone with my thoughts and regrets. I turned 40 a few months ago, and something inside me snapped. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My youth was gone, slipping away little by little. I would look in the mirror and see the lines around my eyes, the graying hair that I tried to hide with dye, the weight I had gained. I wasn't the woman I used to be, and I wasn't sure I liked who I had become. My life felt like a monotonous routine. Richard, once the love of my life, was now a stranger to me. He didn't notice when I dressed up for a night out, and he didn't care when I spent extra time getting ready. Richard used to tell me how beautiful I looked. Now, he barely looked at me. To cope, I threw myself into yoga and gardening. I tried to find fulfillment in something, anything, but it wasn't enough. I couldn't fill the emptiness inside me, the gnawing feeling that I was losing my place in the world, that I was fading into the background. I wanted more than this. I deserved more than this. Then there was Michael, Richard's friend, the man who had everything, the business, the car, the house, the success that always seemed to shine around him. And every time Michael came over, I felt the resentment build inside me. His arrogance, his self-congratulations, his constant reminders of how lucky Richard was to have him as a friend. It all grated on me. I couldn't help but feel small next to him, like I had missed out on something. He always had that glint in his eye, the sense of having conquered life. And me? I was just here, tied to a marriage that had long since lost its spark. "I'm telling you, Richard," Michael would say as we all sat together for dinner, "you're lucky to have someone like me in your corner. Most people never make it to this level. You've got it good, buddy." I would smile, but inside, my heart would ache. Was this what my life had become? Living in the shadow of men who were full of life, full of success, while I stood still, fading into obscurity? It was around that time that Tom entered the picture. He was an intern in my department, a fresh face in the office with energy and ambition. Tom was everything I wasn't anymore. He was young, driven, with a spark in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. It started with small conversations, mostly work-related. But the more we talked, the more I noticed something. Tom looked at me in a way Richard hadn't for years. He noticed things about me, my work ethic, my knowledge, my experience. He complimented me, not just on my work, but on the way I carried myself. It was so strange at first, this attention, but it felt good. We'd go out for lunch after a long morning at the office. And while Richard was at home, glued to his work emails, I found myself talking to Tom about everything: life, work, personal ambitions. He would listen, really listen, when I talked. He seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. And when he saw that I was sad or frustrated, he would say things that made me feel seen. "You know, Liza," he said one afternoon, over a salad in the cafe near the office, "you have this amazing energy about you. It's like you're a leader. I can tell you've done a lot in your career, and you're still going strong." It was a simple compliment, but it hit me in a way I hadn't expected. It felt like someone had finally acknowledged all the things I had been doing right, all the things I had worked so hard for. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that until he said it. At home, Richard was oblivious. He didn't even notice when I started coming home later from work, spending hours away from him. When I did get home, the only thing he said was, "You're late." Everything okay? His attention was always elsewhere. On his projects, on his work, on his phone. I started feeling like I wasn't even important to him anymore. And then, a few weeks later, the conference trip came up. A business trip to another city, and Tom and I were scheduled to go together. At first, I wasn't sure how I felt about it, but I knew that it was a chance to get away from the suffocating silence at home. It started off professionally, as expected. We attended the same events, participated in discussions, and networked with others. But it was after the events when things started to change. Tom and I would grab dinner, talk about life, about our dreams. He'd listen to my frustrations, and in return, I found myself feeling lighter, happier, like I could breathe again. There was something about being around him that made me feel desired again, like I wasn't invisible. One night, after a long day of conferences, we sat at a small bar, talking and laughing about the things we had missed in life. I hadn't laughed like that in ages. "I'm glad I came on this trip," Tom said, looking at me with those warm, genuine eyes. "It's been nice to just not be focused on work all the time." I smiled, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir inside me. It was confusing, but it felt good. For the first time in months, I felt like I mattered. I wasn't just a wife, a worker, a woman growing old in the shadow of others. I was me again, but it only made the storm inside me worse. The conflict between what I felt with Tom and what I had with Richard grew deeper. I didn't know where to turn. The weight of what I was doing was beginning to settle in my chest, but I couldn't stop. Every time I looked at Tom, every time he smiled at me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, something real, something alive. I kept telling myself it was just a temporary thing, a way to fill the hole inside me, a one-time escape from the emptiness of my marriage. But the lines kept blurring. It started out innocently enough. Late nights at the office, where Tom would find an excuse to stay behind and help me with paperwork, or a project that could have easily been done during the day. One evening, after the others had left, we found ourselves alone in the office. I remember how my heart raced when he leaned in to kiss me, and I didn't pull away. For the first time in ages, I felt desired. Alive. It was like I was reborn. The woman I was in my youth, the woman who didn't feel invisible or forgotten. I knew it was wrong. I knew it went against everything I once believed in, but in that moment, I didn't care. Tom made me feel seen, in a way Richard hadn't in years. We didn't just kiss, it was something more, something that ignited a fire inside me. That night, I went home to Richard, feeling like I was two different people, torn between guilt and a rush of excitement. The next few weeks were a blur of secret meetings, at hotels, in car parks, even in the small meeting rooms at work when we both found ourselves staying late. Each time felt like a desperate escape, a need to feel something real. Tom was always there to offer a kind word, a soft touch, a compliment that made me feel like I mattered. It was intoxicating, but each time I came back to Richard, the guilt gnawed at me. I had moments of clarity when I considered stopping it, when I told myself I was just filling a void that couldn't be filled by a man who didn't care. But each time, Tom would find a way to pull me back in. He was so different from Richard. He was attentive, passionate, and present in ways Richard hadn't been for years. The more I gave into it, the harder it became to stop. I felt like I was drowning in a secret life that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Richard, on the other hand, seemed oblivious. At first, he just chalked it up to me being tired or stressed from work. But as the weeks passed, he began to notice the change. I wasn't as present when we talked. I was always on my phone. I would avoid eye contact. I could feel the tension building in the air every time we were together. He'd try to plan dinners or weekends away, trying to rekindle what we once had. But I always found an excuse not to go. I told myself it was for work, or that I was too tired. But deep down, I knew I was avoiding him, avoiding the man I used to love. "You've been distant lately," Richard said one evening, his voice low, tinged with frustration. "We need to spend more time together. It's like you don't even care anymore." I was silent. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain that I was giving my heart to someone else? That I had stopped caring about him long before I met Tom? "I do care," I muttered, lying through my teeth. I've been busy. Work, you know? He looked at me skeptically, but didn't press further. I could see it in his eyes, the doubt, the confusion. But he didn't see what I saw, what I felt. I wasn't the woman he married anymore. I was someone else entirely. Alicia, my friend at work, started to notice the change too. She was one of the few people who had always been there for me, listening to my complaints and frustrations, offering a shoulder when things weren't great at home. But now, it was clear she saw something was off. "You're different," Alicia said one afternoon, sitting beside me in the break room. "You're not yourself lately. What's going on with you, Liza?" I looked at her, feeling a pang of guilt. I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't tell anyone. It was too much, too messy. And besides, I didn't want to hear her judgment. I didn't want to feel like I was doing something unforgivable. "It's nothing," I lied again, offering her a weak smile. "Just work, you know? I've been stressed." Alicia didn't buy it. She narrowed her eyes, but didn't press. I could see the concern in her face, but I had already pulled away from her. I had pulled away from everyone. The truth was, I didn't know who I was anymore. With Tom, I was someone who was desired, someone who was wanted. But with Richard, I was a shadow of the person I used to be. Every time I looked at him, I felt nothing. He didn't see me. He didn't even try. He was too absorbed in his work, too busy with his meetings and his business plans, too distant to notice that I was disappearing. As the weeks went by, Tom and I grew closer. Our relationship, once just an escape, became something more intense. I needed him more and more. Every time I tried to break away, to walk away from the affair, he would pull me back in with promises of affection, with sweet words that made me feel alive again. But I wasn't just physically drawn to him anymore. I was emotionally dependent on him. I felt like I couldn't live without him, and that terrified me. Richard, completely unaware of my emotional turmoil, started spending more time with Michael. They would have long discussions about business plans, about investments, about future projects. Richard became more absorbed in his work, and I continued to drown in my own lies. At one point, I decided to do something to try and fix things. I thought maybe I could recapture what we had, or at least make it seem like I still cared. I organized a party at home, something special. I tried to create a romantic atmosphere, complete with candles, music, and a homemade dinner. I dressed up, hoping maybe, just maybe, I could rekindle some spark. But Richard didn't even notice. He didn't notice the effort I put into it. Instead, he sat there, lost in his thoughts, not even pretending to care. The disappointment was overwhelming. It was like everything I did, every attempt to fix our relationship, was futile. He didn't know about Tom, but somehow, I felt like he already did. The cracks in our marriage were no longer hidden. And though Richard didn't have proof, it was obvious that something had changed. Something irreparable. But I kept pretending. I kept lying to myself, lying to him, and to everyone around me. I never imagined it would happen like this. It all started so innocently. A message here, a joke there. But it escalated quickly, and I found myself trapped in a world where lies were the only thing keeping me afloat. Then, it all fell apart. It was a Saturday morning, just like any other. Richard had gone to his office, and I was still lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to numb the sinking feeling in my stomach. I had gotten used to this routine. Waking up, pretending everything was normal, and waiting for my next meeting with Tom. It had become a dangerous dance, but I couldn't stop. That morning, however, I had left my phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. It was a mistake I would regret for the rest of my life. Richard came home earlier than I expected. I didn't even hear him enter the house. But I heard the silence. The kind of silence that makes your blood run cold. He was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, holding my phone. His face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. I could see the realization slowly dawning on him. The texts, the messages, the plans to meet. He had never checked my phone before, and I never imagined he would. But there it was, clear as day, my betrayal. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at the screen, his fingers trembling. I thought maybe he hadn't processed it yet. Maybe he didn't know what he was looking at. But then he whispered, almost to himself, "Tom." I felt my heart drop into my stomach. The panic hit me like a tidal wave. He had seen it all. The meetings, the secret rendezvous, the stolen moments that had cost me everything. Richard, I started, but I couldn't find the words. He didn't let me finish. His eyes darkened, and he tossed the phone onto the kitchen table, turning away from me. For the first time in years, I saw a side of Richard the first hadn't seen. A side I wasn't sure I knew how to deal with. He was broken, shattered. His voice shook when he spoke. "How long?" he asked, not looking at me. I couldn't answer. The truth was too hard to face. "It's not what you think, Richard," I stammered, but the words felt hollow. He turned back to face me, his face a mixture of disbelief and hurt. "It's exactly what I think, Liza. You've been sleeping with him. All this time. Behind my back." I tried to explain, to make him understand, but nothing I said could undo the damage. I watched as the man I had once loved, the man who had always been there for me, crumble before my eyes. And in that moment, I felt a terrible mixture of guilt and relief. It was over. The lies had caught up with me. But in his eyes, I saw something else, something cold, something calculating. Richard wasn't just hurt. He was angry. He was furious. In that silence, I could feel the walls closing in around me. But Richard didn't shout. He didn't demand answers. He just looked at me, like I was a stranger. "I can't believe you did this," he said quietly, his voice full of pain. "After everything we've been through, all these years, you do this to me." It was then that I realized, it wasn't just betrayal he was feeling. It was a deep sense of humiliation, of lost trust. He wasn't just angry at me. He was angry at himself for trusting me, for believing in a lie. But what happened next was something I hadn't expected. Instead of leaving, instead of confronting me in the way I thought he would, Richard did something I never imagined. He left the house without saying another word. He didn't even pack his things. He just left. I didn't know where he went at first, but I soon found out. Richard had reconnected with Jessica, an old friend from his past, someone he had once had a short romance with when they were young. I hadn't even realized that Jessica had become a part of his life again. But once I found out, I couldn't ignore it. He wasn't just hurt. He wasn't just broken. He was moving on. At first, I thought it was temporary, that it was just a way to cope with the pain. But soon, it became clear that Richard was turning to Jessica for emotional support. They began spending more and more time together. Late-night phone calls, long walks, dinner dates. I couldn't help but feel the jealousy rise in me, like a bitter taste in the back of my throat. Why was he so quick to move on? Why wasn't he fighting for us? The truth was, Richard wasn't fighting for us anymore. He was moving on, finding solace in the arms of someone who understood him in ways I never had. And as much as I hated it, I couldn't blame him. He had every right to find comfort, to seek the connection I had failed to provide. But as I watched him grow closer to Jessica, something inside me shifted. The guilt and shame that had plagued me for weeks began to transform into something darker, something colder. I wasn't just sorry anymore. I was angry. Angry that I had been the one to betray him. Angry that he was moving on while I was left behind. I realized that I had lost more than just Richard. I had lost myself, my self-respect, my sense of security, my dignity. And the more I saw Richard with Jessica, the more I felt the need for revenge. I started to reconsider everything. My affair with Tom, my marriage with Richard, everything I thought I wanted. I couldn't just sit by and watch Richard rebuild his life while I was stuck in this empty shell of a marriage. I had to do something. I started to withdraw from Tom. The excitement, the passion, it was no longer enough. He was just a distraction. I didn't need him anymore. What I needed was a sense of control, a way to regain the power I had lost when Richard found out about my betrayal. One night, I suggested we go on a vacation together, just the two of us, to try to fix things. But Richard wasn't interested. He refused, saying he had other plans. The sting of rejection hit me harder than I expected. I didn't know it at the time, but Richard had already made his choice. He had already decided he was done with me. The pain I had caused him had left a permanent mark, and nothing I could do would change that. As I watched him slip away, I realized that the person I had once been, the confident, self-assured woman, was gone, and in her place was a broken, empty shell, desperately trying to find something to hold on to. Even Tom, with all his attention and affection, couldn't fill that void. I had traded real connection for fleeting moments of excitement, and now I was left with nothing. Richard's betrayal, his newfound connection with Jessica, was a reminder of everything I had lost. And as much as I wanted to hold on, I knew it was too late. The damage had been done, and I had no one to blame but myself. I was drowning in my own guilt. I had spent years building a life with Richard, only to watch it crumble in the span of a few months. The weight of my mistakes pressed down on me, suffocating me with every breath. And yet, in the midst of all this chaos, I couldn't let go of the hope that maybe, just maybe, I could fix it. I could fix us. But no matter how hard I tried, it felt like I was trying to rebuild a house that had already burned to the ground. I began making all the efforts I should have made long before. One night, I decided to cook Richard's favorite meal, a dinner I knew would remind him of the early days of our marriage when we'd sit around the table and talk about everything. I spent hours preparing, setting the table just so, hoping that it would rekindle something in him. I even lit the candles we used to love. When he came home, his face was tired, distant. I saw the exhaustion in his eyes, but there was no spark, no recognition of the effort I was making. We ate in silence, with only the clinking of utensils breaking the stillness between us. I tried to make conversation, but Richard's answers were short, his mind clearly elsewhere. He barely glanced at me. It was like I didn't even exist in his world anymore. "Richard, I know things have been hard," I said, trying to break through. "But we've been through so much. I want to fix this. I miss us." He didn't respond right away. He just stared at his plate, pushing the food around. "It's too late for that, Liza," he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Too much has happened. We've both changed. I don't know if we can come back from this." My heart broke. I could feel the walls between us growing higher and higher, brick by brick. And yet, I couldn't stop myself from trying to scale them. But Richard's mind was no longer on me. He was with Jessica. More and more, I saw her presence in his life. She began staying over at his apartment, their weekends away becoming more frequent. I could see it in his eyes when he talked about her, the way he lit up when he said her name. He was there with her, emotionally, in a way he hadn't been with me for years. They shared everything, the kind of connection I had once dreamed of having with him. They talked about their feelings, about the things that truly mattered. They shared experiences and moments I had never been part of, things that once belonged to me. And the worst part? Richard didn't even try to hide it from me. He didn't feel the need to keep it secret. "Jessica gets me, Liza," he said one evening, his words cutting through me like a knife. "She actually listens when I talk. She understands what I'm going through. You never did." Each word felt like a slap in the face. My chest tightened, and I wanted to scream, to cry, to make him understand the pain I was in. But all I could do was nod silently, knowing that nothing I said would change anything. Alicia, my friend, saw through the mask I tried to wear. I tried to keep everything together, to act like I was fine, but she saw the cracks. She had been there for me when things were good, and she was still there when things were falling apart. "Liza," she said one evening, sitting with me after I had spent hours crying, "you need to face the truth. Richard is gone. He's not the man you married anymore. And you've got to stop letting this tear you apart." I looked at her, desperate. "I don't know what to do, Alicia. I've lost him. I've ruined everything." She shook her head, her face full of concern. "It's not just about him. What about you, Liza? You've lost yourself in this. You can't keep doing this to yourself." But I couldn't hear her. My heart was still fixated on Richard, on the life I once thought we would have together. Every part of me wanted to turn back time, to undo the hurt I had caused. But the reality was sinking in. It wasn't just Richard the first had lost. It was myself. I began to spiral inward, questioning everything about who I was. Why had I turned to Tom? Was it just a way to fill the void, or had I truly wanted him? Why had I felt so desperate to feel desired by someone else? These questions plagued me, making it even harder to find any semblance of peace. Tom was still in my life, pushing for more time, more attention. He had become insistent, demanding more of me emotionally and physically. Every time I tried to distance myself from him, he pulled me back in with his promises of affection and desire. I thought that maybe he could fill the empty space in my heart, but it only made me feel more alone. His attention wasn't enough to fix what was broken inside me. The affair, once so thrilling, had turned into a source of guilt and regret. The more time I spent with Tom, the more disconnected I became from the life I had once known, the life with Richard. I was trapped in a cycle of emotional dependency, unable to break free. Meanwhile, Richard and Jessica's relationship continued to grow stronger. They were no longer just two people reconnecting after years of separation. They had built something real, something that made me feel like an outsider. He shared his thoughts, his pain, his dreams with her. The things he had never shared with me in the last few years of our marriage. I could see it in the way he spoke about her, the way he talked about their future. And with every passing day, I realized that I had lost him completely. I tried one last time to make things right. I planned a romantic dinner and arranged a surprise getaway to the place where we first met. I even bought him a thoughtful gift, something small but meaningful. I wanted to remind him of the man I used to be, the woman he had once loved. But when I gave him the gift, he didn't react. He didn't even smile. "It's too late, Liza," he said, his voice cold. "I've moved on. I can't keep pretending that things will go back to how they were." The finality in his voice was like a punch to the gut. I had tried everything. I had done everything I could think of, but it wasn't enough. Richard's heart had already been given to someone else. And now, I was left alone with the consequences of my actions, a broken marriage, a lost sense of self, and the painful realization that no amount of effort could change the course we were on. I thought I could fix it. I thought I could undo the damage. But I was wrong. And now, I had to face the truth. Richard was gone, and so was the life I had built with him. The day Richard told me he wanted a divorce, I knew it was coming. But hearing the words, hearing the finality in his voice, hit me like a physical blow. He sat across from me in the living room, his face devoid of emotion, his posture stiff as if he had already made peace with what he was about to say. "I've thought about this for a long time, Liza," Richard began, his voice calm but firm. "I don't feel anything for you anymore. Not the way I should. Not the way we used to. I've been seeing Jessica for a while now, and she's the one who's been there for me. She's the one who understands me, who gives me the emotional support I've needed for years. I can't live in the past anymore. It's over." I wanted to scream, to beg him to take it all back, but I couldn't find the words. What could I say? What was there left to say? I had pushed him away, and now he was gone. Richard, the man I had shared my life with, had already made his choice. And it wasn't me. "I'm sorry, but it's time for us to go our separate ways," he said, looking at me for the first time since he'd started talking. His gaze was steady, almost indifferent. It hurt more than I could explain. "Richard, please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "We can work through this. We can fix it. We've been through worse, haven't we?" But he shook his head slowly. "It's too late for that. I've already moved on. I need to live my life now. I need to be with someone who truly sees me." And just like that, my world crumbled. Everything I had tried to hold on to, every last shred of hope, evaporated in that moment. I wasn't the woman he wanted anymore. I wasn't the woman he needed. Richard was right. We had both changed, but he had found someone who understood him, someone who could give him what I no longer could. And now, he was leaving me behind. Jessica and Richard's relationship intensified after that. They began talking about their future, their plans. Richard was looking at homes with her, planning a life in a new city. One that wasn't tainted by the memories of me. One where they could start fresh. It was a painful thing to hear, knowing that the future I had once dreamed of was now being built by someone else. "Jessica and I are thinking of moving to Portland," Richard had told me one evening, as though it was a casual conversation, something we could talk about without emotion. "It's a fresh start for both of us." I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. "I see," was all I managed to say. It was clear now. Richard had chosen her. He was starting a new chapter, and I was left with nothing but the wreckage of what once was. I fell into a deep grief. I had lost everything. My marriage, my self-respect, my place in Richard's life. I thought back on all the decisions that had led me here. The affair, the choices I made in the desperate attempt to feel alive again. I had chased after youth, after something that wasn't real, and in doing so, I had destroyed the best thing I had ever had. And yet, the loss wasn't just Richard. It was also the loss of who I had been. I had become someone I didn't recognize, someone driven by desire and emotional hunger, but without any understanding of how to fill the emptiness inside. And now, that emptiness seemed insurmountable. Tom, too, had grown distant. He had been there, in the beginning, offering me something: attention, affection, excitement. But as I became consumed by my grief, by my inability to move on from Richard, Tom's patience wore thin. "I can't keep doing this, Liza," he told me one day, his voice soft but firm. "I need someone who can give me more than just bits and pieces. You're not emotionally available. I can't keep waiting for you to figure things out." It stung, more than I expected. But deep down, I knew he was right. I had nothing left to give. Tom wasn't the solution to my problems. He was just another distraction, another way to avoid confronting the reality of what I had lost. With both Richard and Tom gone, I was left with the most painful realization of all. I had been searching for something outside of myself to fill the void, but it was never going to come from anyone else. The emptiness I felt was something I had to face alone. I took a hard look at my life. I realized that I had spent so much of my time defining myself by my relationships with others, as Richard's wife, as Tom's lover, that I had lost sight of who I truly was. I was no longer just a wife, a lover, or a mother. I was me, and if I wanted to heal, if I wanted to find peace, I had to rediscover that person. It wasn't easy. I quit my job. Every corner of that office felt like a reminder of my failure, of everything I had lost. I wanted something new, something that would allow me to reconnect with myself. I pursued a career path I had always been curious about, something creative, something personal, and I began therapy. It was terrifying at first, to look inward, to examine the things I had done, the choices I had made. But slowly, I started to understand why I had acted the way I did, why I had sought validation from others instead of from myself. It was painful, but it was necessary. Through therapy, I began to rebuild my self-worth, to learn how to stand on my own 2 feet again. Meanwhile, Richard and Jessica moved to their new city, just as they had planned. I could see through the occasional updates on social media that they were happy, building a life together. And part of me resented them, resented Richard for moving on so quickly, but part of me understood. He had to move forward, just like I had to. As for me, I started to find myself again, slowly but surely. I attended a reunion with old friends from college, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel defined by my past mistakes. I realized that while those mistakes had shaped me, they didn't have to control my future. I wasn't the person I used to be, but I was someone new, someone who had learned, someone who could still change. I started to make new friends, to build a healthier social circle. And while I knew I wasn't healed completely, I also knew that my journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Richard and I had both moved on. Our paths had diverged in ways I never thought possible, but in the end, we had both learned painful lessons about ourselves. We had both been broken, but we had also both found new paths toward healing and happiness. And as I looked toward my future, I realized that I had the power to shape it, to create something new, something that was mine, and mine alone.